Genshin Impact's 3.8 patch will have a lot of 5-star characters people have been waiting for what seems like an eternity to get. And while some people know exactly who they want to get, a lot of people are having trouble deciding. That's why in this video we'll go over Klee, Eula, Kokomi, and Wanderer's strengths, weaknesses, team viability, and overall value, so that way you'll know if one of these upcoming 5 stars is worth your primogems. After I break down each character, I will tell you exactly who the best value for your primogems is and give you a proven strategy that will help you get characters you really want in the future. Each of the 5 stars on this list will receive a rating from bad to great in several categories, including personal damage, support capability, team flexibility, and free-to-play friendliness. I'll also recommend characters that would make good teammates for these 5 stars, since you often need specific characters to really unlock the power of a limited 5-star character. But as always, if you know exactly who you want already, then wish for them. This is a guide to help clarify what the 3.8 limited 5-star characters can do well and what they struggle with, so you'll be better prepared to solve any problems that arise when you play them. With that said, let's begin the grading with the only child to simultaneously be on every single no-fly list ever made, the Spark Knight Klee. Klee is an on-field pyro damage dealer whose entire kit revolves around her causing explosions. Normal attacks are cute tiny little bombs. Her charge attack summons a mini flower satellite cannon that explodes enemies right in front of her. Her skill releases a bouncing bomb that leaves behind several other tiny little bomblets, and her burst shoots an array of pyro all over the place while she's on the field. As you may have already guessed, Klee is really a pyromaniac, and that is very much reflected in the amount of pyro she creates on field. There's just so much fire. Klee's massive amount of pyro application means it's hard for a lot of characters to work well with her in reaction teams outside of characters like C6 Xingqiu or Yelan. However, using those characters or even using them together in a double hydro team does work incredibly well, but at the opportunity cost of using 2 of the most in-demand characters in the game on one team just for Klee. And while this team may be strong, it isn't the best in the game, and you'd often be better served using these other characters that work well with Klee on other teams instead. The 2 other things to know when it comes to Klee are her size and playstyle really do matter a lot. Klee is among the shortest characters in the game, and that means that her dash and movement are a lot more stunted than taller characters. And even though she's a catalyst character, she basically has to play at melee range because her attacks only go a short distance away from her. This really isn't great, as Klee's bread and butter is using her special charged attack. You see, Klee has a chance to get a special clover buff when she crits, and this allows her to perform a charge attack that deals more damage and costs 0 stamina. However, since her range is so tiny, you'll basically have to be right next to an enemy to hit them. This, coupled with Klee's small stature, her attacks that lock her in place, her shortened dash, and her small HP pool, makes Klee feel a bit clunky and difficult to use at times. You can cancel her attack animation with stutter stepping or jumping to give her more mobility, but even this can feel really annoying. And just a bit of Shark trivia for you, Klee just so happened to be my very first 5-star character, and she carried me through AR50 Plus initially, but is the adorable bomb baby worth your primogems now? Klee's personal damage is good. She's an on-field damage dealer that can unload a lot of damage with the right setup, but often has to rely on characters like Xingqiu, Yelan, and Zhongli. Sadly, characters like Yoimiya and Hu Tao outshine her in single-target DPS, and Xiangling is much better for AoE, especially since Xiangling can work off-field. If Klee's burst did work off-field, she would be a top-tier pyro character to this day, but sadly that is not the case. So overall, Klee's damage is good, but she really does get outshined by a lot of other pyro characters. But at least she's better than Dea. Klee's support capability is bad. She is an on-field DPS character that doesn't benefit the team if she's not on the field. While her little bomblets from her skill do persist even when she switches out, her burst immediately ends upon switching, and you obviously can't use her special enhanced charge attack if she's not on the field. This means she has the typical hypercarry syndrome, which means that you have to build a team entirely around her, and you have to fit her needs because she doesn't help the team otherwise. Klee's team flexibility is bad. Klee applies too much pyro to really work with many characters, and that really limits her team options. She's essentially locked into teams that use Xingqiu, Yelan, Kazuha, Venti, Sucrose, Bennett, and a shield character. But her damage is not so high that it would warrant bringing Klee over a character like Xiangling and using another character in place of Klee instead. You can use Overload with Klee for some extra explosive fun, but since her range is pretty bad, you have to get an enemy right up against a wall, otherwise the Overload explosions will keep knocking them away from you, and then you'll have to chase them down with your stubby little elf legs. So because she's a hyper carry with limited team options, and you can often make similar Klee team setups without her that would actually be better, her team flexibility rating is bad. Klee's free-to-play friendliness is bad. Unfortunately, Klee has seen better days and is left behind by stronger pyro DPS characters that have been introduced since her original arrival. She's even outclassed by a 4-star character like Xiangling in a lot of cases. And considering we get Xiangling for free, Klee's free-to-play value drops even further. Klee doesn't have many great free-to-play weapon options outside of the Dodo Coattails, which was a limited event weapon that you can't get now, the Mappa Mare being her best free-to-play craftable weapon otherwise, but it's not really that amazing for her. And something like the Woodsith or the Battle Pass weapon, the Solar Pearl, are much better for her. Klee's overall grading is okay. Her damage isn't bad, but her clunky playstyle and the fact that there are much better pyro DPS choices really do hold her back. Even though Klee was my very first 5-star and I have a special place in my heart for her, I would not recommend using your primogems on Klee unless you just really like her. Recommended teammates for Klee include Xingqiu, Yelan, Venti, Kazuha, Sucrose, Bennett, and Zhongli or any other strong shield character. Next is a character that hasn't had a rerun in so long that people don't even think she's real, the Spindrift Knight, Eula. Eula is a physical, on-field DPS character that was supposed to be Hoyo's attempt at fixing physical teams. In case you aren't aware, the Genshin community was calling for Hoyo to buff Geo and physical for a very long time. Geo did get a buff, sort of, in that Geo Resonance is now actually nice, and they also got characters like Goro and a more defensive scaling character like Ito and Yunjin to pair along with characters like Noelle and Albedo. Physical though, well, let's just say instead of trying to fix physical or make superconduct better, they just made Eula. A character who does a lot of physical damage, and that's basically it. And you may be deceived by Eula's vision into thinking she's a cryo character, but all of her damage is actually based on physical or non-elemental damage. Her gameplay revolves around her burst, which takes time to charge like a physical damage dealing spirit bomb. But instead of taking energy from entire planets, Eula's burst charges when she normal attacks or uses her skill after using her burst. The more stacks you build before the burst detonates, the more damage it does, and when it does go off, it can easily deal hundreds of thousands of damage if it actually hits, and if it crits, and if a few other things happen. While Eula's playstyle of having building up stacks to buff a time-released physical explosion sounds really fun, it can actually be quite annoying. Enemies can move out of the way, become invulnerable, or even get knocked away from you just far enough as her burst is going off, making her foes avoid the damage altogether. And in certain situations, you might be really relying on that burst to crit, which may or may not happen. Both of these cases are much more pronounced against bosses or in the Spiral Abyss, but if you only want to use Eula in domains or in the overworld, you run into a different issue. And that is the weird situation that Eula finds herself in because she is both too strong and too weak. About 50% of Eula's damage comes from her normal attacks, which not only hit very hard, but since they're physical damage, they often get buffed by various sources that Eula builds to increase physical damage. The problem is that you can often beat enemies with just your normal attacks before her burst goes off, leading to a burst that hits for nothing and is completely wasted. On the flip side, if you fight some really tanky enemies, like in the upper floors of the Spiral Abyss, her burst actually isn't that strong. Sure, 100,000 or 200,000 damage is really nice, but a free-to-play Hyper Bloom team can do the same damage or more. And don't forget that you end up putting so much of your damage into Eula's burst that if it misses or if it doesn't crit, it's like you just lost 50% of your total damage. Talk about putting way too many eggs in one basket. To top it off, a lot of enemies you face, specifically Ruin enemies like Ruin Guards or the Perpetual Mechanical Array, have a 70% physical resistance, so Eula will feel a lot worse against those types of enemies. Luckily, physical damage does do more against humanoid enemies like Kairagi, Nobushi, Hilichurls, and Treasure Hoarders, but those enemies usually don't pose too big of a threat compared to other enemies. So that's why Eula is in a weird spot. In the overworld, she can be too strong and never get to use her burst because enemies die too quickly, but against bosses and in the Spiral Abyss, she can feel too weak because there's just so much riding on the final single hit of her elemental burst that may fail in just way too many ways to account for. With these factors in mind, let's grade the most beautiful dancer of noble vengeance, Eula. Eula's personal damage is great. Eula has a high base attack, and her normal attacks get a really big buff because you typically build physical damage bonus, which also buffs her normal attacks. They can easily hit for 12 to 15k a piece, and are honestly very satisfying to use. Her burst, while very inconsistent, does do a huge nuke of AoE damage when everything lines up just right. Eula's support capability is bad. She has typical hypercarry syndrome, she has to be on the field to do damage, and if she's not, then she contributes nothing to the team. This also means that you basically have to build an entire team around Eula to really make her work at all. Eula's team flexibility is bad. Even though she's a cryo character, you're really only going to use her on physical teams with 1 or 2 electro characters for superconduct, just so you can get that extra physical resistance shred. She's also a hyper carry, so limited team options and no support capability keep her pigeonholed into very specific teams, and unfortunately that means her team flexibility is quite bad. Eula's free-to-play friendliness is good. Even though physical is not great, it does feel really good to use in the overworld, and you can get a free 4-star weapon called the Snow-Tombed Star Silver that works perfectly for Eula, and it also looks amazing on her. And while Eula's team comps are very restrictive, she does enough damage in the overworld and domains that you can just ignore her optimal team comps if you really want to. The only problem is that when you go into harder content, Eula's weaknesses become much more apparent. Eula's overall rating is okay. Her damage is great, but honestly, if all you're concerned with is damage, there are easier ways to get it with less investment, i.e. Hyper Bloom teams. The backloaded damage of Eula's burst is inconsistent at best, and really annoying when it doesn't work, plus her teams are restrictive, and physical teams are just honestly in bad shape. Eula is a character like Klee, where I would not recommend you pulling for her unless you really like her and just want to use her regardless of how good she is or how much value she'll bring your account. And I was seriously hoping the reason Eula has not had a rerun in almost 2 years is because Hoyo was working on a fix for physical teams, but sadly that doesn't seem to be the case. Recommended teammates for Eula include Mika, Fischl, Diona, Layla, Kuki, Rosaria, Raiden, and Zhongli. Our next 5-star on the list is the elegant shrine maiden who looks much taller than she actually is, Kokomi. Kokomi is supposed to be a brilliant strategist, and the reason the resistance didn't immediately crumble under the Raiden Shogun's might, but let's just say that she has some questionable ideas. Especially when her idea of flawless strategy is giving up 100% crit rate for 25% healing bonus? But this actually reveals Kokomi's main strategy, deception. Kokomi is classified as a healer and support by Hoyo, yet she can very easily be a solid on-field DPS despite having a trait that gives her minus 100% crit rate. And even though she can be an on-field DPS, Kokomi finds her best place in freeze teams or Nilou Bloom teams. Now she's typically used just to place her jellyfish, heal the team, and then only use her burst so she can refresh her jellyfish and put it back up again. So even though she can be a DPS, she's basically just used for her elemental skill. And while Kokomi suffers a little bit from an identity crisis, she is still pretty versatile. So, how does the Sangonomiya Shrine Maiden stack up against the other limited 5 stars? It's time to assess the general's capabilities. Her personal damage is good, or at least it can be. Kokomi's normal attacks inside of her burst can hit for pretty high amounts of damage, but you won't really notice them that much because they're not going to crit and they're not going to show the big numbers. Typically a well-built Kokomi can hit for between 6,000 to 8,000 per normal attack. And if you manage to vaporize her charge attack, it can easily hit for 20,000 to 30,000. However, most people build Kokomi to just be a heal bot, so her damage definitely isn't as great when she's only focused on healing. Kokomi's support capability is great. She provides a source of off-field hydro, and that's a very rare and very desired commodity in Genshin Impact. She can also heal the team, and she also provides other team buffs, whether in the form of the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayer's Catalyst or energy regeneration for herself with the prototype Amber. She is also not too picky about artifact sets, so you can run Kokomi with something like Tenacity of the Millilith to give your team even more attack, or you can give her something like the Deepwood Memory set if you're running her on a Nilou or Dendro team, so you can use other artifact sets on your other characters that may not necessarily want to run the Deepwood Memory set. And of course, you can use the Ocean-Hued Clam, which will take the excess healing that Kokomi will often provide because she heals so much, and turn that into a nice bubble burst of physical damage. So the off-field hydro application, the healing, and the extra team buff she can bring make her support capability great. Kokomi's team flexibility is good. Oftentimes, Xingqiu and Yulan get more praise and are more desired than Kokomi because Kokomi's off-field hydro application is rather slow. Xingqiu and Yulan not only provide very fast hydro application, but they provide a lot of it too. So Kokomi just gets outshined because she cannot keep up with the very high amounts of hydro that are necessary for a lot of the really good teams. Unless you're playing her on field, but if you do that, that limits the amount of hyper carries you can use and Kokomi's off-field support capability quite a bit. However, she is usable in just about any team that wants a hydro character, and she's found a very special place in freeze teams and Nilou Bloom teams. Kokomi's free-to-play friendliness is great. Two of her best weapons are the prototype Amber and the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers. The former is craftable and easy to access, and the Thrilling Tales of Dragon Slayers is a gacha weapon, but it is a 3-star weapon, and you probably have a ton of them lying around. The fact that she is a healer, while she can also be built as a DPS without really sacrificing any of her healing capability, makes her great for new players with limited characters. She can consolidate multiple roles, she helps your team survive, and because you get access to free Dendro characters in Kale and the Dendro Traveler, you can make some really strong teams with Kokomi right out of the box without having to gacha for any other specific characters. Considering all these factors, Kokomi's overall rating is good to potentially great. She's got a lot of versatility in her roles, whether you want to run her as a DPS or as a pure healer and support, but regardless, any healing is always nice, and she does a lot of it. Hydro is also an extremely useful element, easily top 3 in the game, and having a consistent source of off-field Hydro is really nice. I don't know who at Hoyo thought it was a good idea to give her minus 100% crit as a passive trait, because I like the dopamine hit when I see big number, but the truth is that Kokomi can still do good damage without any crits. Recommended teammates for Kokomi include Nilou and Dendro characters for Nilou Bloom teams, Ayaka, Ganyu, and if you plan to use her as an on-field DPS, then just about any Electro, Pyro, Dendro, Cryo, or Animo VV support characters for teams like Vaporize, Electrocharge, Freeze, Hyperbloom, and Burgeon. Kokomi may not be the absolute best in all of these teams, but she does enable quite a few of them to function well, even if not optimally. The next 5-star on the list is a Sojourning Hat Guy that everyone has garnered a lot of hype for in the past. It's the former 6th Fatui Harbinger and God wannabe Scaramouch, or as he's known now, Wanderer. Wanderer is an on-field anemo DPS whose special mechanic involves channeling the powers of Zahir to float in the air and shoot wind blades at opponents. His skill puts him into a floating state, and in that state his normal attacks and charge attacks are enhanced, and he can use charge attacks without consuming any stamina. He does, however, consume Koguryoku points, which are basically just a floating meter that shows how long you can stay airborne. He can move freely in his floating state, but if he ascends or dashes, his airtime decreases much faster, as noted by his floating meter. Wanderer does have a passive talent that allows him to get a free dash and shoot some homing wind arrows when he performs the dash, but this free dash passive procs randomly, and it's therefore inconsistent, and shouldn't be relied on. His burst is just a big extra stomp of damage that is really satisfying to use, and has also awakened some odd feelings about wanting to be stepped on, at least according to many players' Twitter accounts. But there's a couple really important things to note about Wanderer. Number 1, his hurt box is deceptively large when he's floating. It extends all the way to the bottom of his feet, which just so happens to be the same height as a tall character. This means that Wanderer is actually a lot more vulnerable in the air than he seems, and that he will get hit by attacks that it looks like he can avoid. While you can ascend Wanderer upwards to avoid more attacks, that reduces your floating meter by a lot, and it also severely cuts down your damage window. The second important thing to know is that he has no interruption resistance while he's floating. This means that if you don't use a shield with him and get hit, it's going to feel really bad. When he gets hit, he has to fall all the way to the ground, and then he has to float back up, and all this time he's still vulnerable to a new wave of attacks. Because this special fall and get up has its own special animation that takes a while, and his floating meter is still going the entire time, getting hit once can mean you can lose virtually all of your floating meter before you can attack again. And since he's in the air a lot of the time, that means that he's also very perceptible to being juggled by enemies with ranged attacks. Honestly, it just feels absolutely terrible to play Wanderer without a shield, so if you plan to use him, I highly recommend pairing him with a good shielding character. So how does the angsty electro-turned-anemo Hatboy stack up? And does he truly earn the nickname that I gave him? Let's give Scaramouch the Wanderer a rating. Wanderer's personal damage is good to great. He is a hyper carry, so that is to be expected, but what's not to be expected is how he achieves his damage. Wanderer needs a lot more investment than other hyper carries because he isn't relying on any reactions to amplify his damage. Instead, he's relying on very good artifacts, weapons, specific characters that can buff his anemo damage, and attack speed. As the only real sources for buffing anemo damage are Farazan, and buffing attack speed are either Eula's signature weapon, the Song of Broken Pines, or Mika, he doesn't have access to a lot of the things he really wants. At least compared to a lot of other characters. These factors can make Wanderer feel very underwhelming, as my level 90 C1 Skyward Atlas 2300 plus attack, 53 crit, 203 crit damage, triple crowned Wanderer teams end up doing less damage than a decent reaction team. And now you might know why I named him what I did. Wanderer's support capability is bad. He is a typical hypercarry and thus has hypercarry syndrome. If he isn't on the field doing damage, then he is not contributing to the team since his entire kit is only meant to work on field and he doesn't provide any form of buff, sustain, or other advantage for teammates. Wanderer's team flexibility is good. Despite his best teams being quite niche, you can use Wanderer in pretty much any team that you would use Sucrose as a driver in, i.e. Vaporize, Freeze, Taser, and so forth. His personal damage is good, and running him with off-field damage dealers makes the team feel a lot better. Just note that you really don't want to build him with Elemental Mastery for swirl damage, you just want to build him with lots of attack and crit. He also has a unique problem in that some forms of off-field damage, particularly the types that follow your character like Kaya's Burst, will follow Wanderer as he floats, making them completely miss enemies unless the enemy is just massively tall. Wanderer's free-to-play friendliness is bad. If you don't have the Widsith or a good 5-star DPS catalyst, Wanderer basically has no other good free-to-play options for weapons. And even the Battle Pass weapon, the Solar Pearl, is pretty bad on him since he can't maintain its passive. A lot of Anemo characters are known for being broken and very free-to-play friendly, but that's because of the Viridescent artifact set combined with the fact that those Anemo characters are supports that can also do a lot of damage with the swirl reaction. Wanderer is not typically built this way and is in fact a lot closer to Zhao in that he deals a lot of Anemo damage but doesn't care about swirling, he just wants to do big numbers. And it's also really terrible that Wanderer's best damage support, Farazan, has pretty much all of her power locked behind her Constellation 6, and wishing for a C6 4-star on a rate-up banner is a gigantic trap that will roughly cost you about 39,200 primogems on average. So while Wanderer can work in a variety of teams, if you really want to unlock his potential, he's going to need so much investment in resin and primogem wise that he's going to get a bad rating for free-to-play friendliness. Recommended teammates for Wanderer include Zhongli or other good shielder, Bennett, Farazan, Mika, Yunjin, or other team comps where Sucrose is the team driver like Taser, Freeze, or National. And with the gradings finished, who should you wish for? Well, here's the thing, you shouldn't. At least if you're unsure about a character. If you really like one of the characters in the upcoming patch, then go ahead and wish for them. But overall, the 5 stars on this patch are just kinda mid. They have some potential, but considering we just came from the Kazuha and Alhaitham banners, they do feel very underwhelming. However, if I were to rank the characters in order from best to worst value for your primogems, it would be Kokomi as the best, then Wanderer, then Eula, then Klee as the worst value for your primogems. But honestly, for most people, there's a huge difference between how good Kokomi is and how useful she is compared to Eula and Klee, so it's not exactly an even ranking. Kokomi is actually a very good character and will be very useful in the future, whereas characters like Eula and Klee have problems that are baked into them that cannot be solved unless they get an actual rework, i.e. Klee's range and clunkiness, and Eula's backloaded damage missing or just not working. But even with that said, I would highly suggest that you save your primogems during this patch. If you do want to wish, then the better characters are on the second half of the patch, i.e. Phase 2 of patch 3.8. And during the second half of the patch, we will get the 4.0 Fontaine version preview. So if you're unsure about which characters to wish for, then wait for the 4.0 livestream to make your decision. You may find that you really like or really dislike the new characters and the new region, and that will really help you solidify your wishing decision. Also keep in mind that they will announce other rerun characters in 4.0, and they may be the ones that you've wanted a lot more than the 3.8 characters. And if you're like me and saving for the Hydro Archon, you should still be fine wishing on the characters in patch 3.8 and still be able to get the Hydro Archon when she comes out. It's very likely that the Hydro Archon will not come until patch 4.2, so you can wish on patch 3.8 and you should be able to save enough for her. But this is only speculation, since it would follow the same Archon release pattern, but just make sure to watch the 4.0 livestream to make sure they aren't releasing her immediately. I hope this review has been helpful and clarified the value of certain characters for you. Please let me know which characters you're going for, and don't be afraid to stop by on Twitch and ask for my Shark Blessing. 50% of the time, it works 100% of the time. I love you, stay jawsome, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.